governing metropolitan areas in Latin America. Hector's a great colleague, and he's coming from the National Council on Science and Technology in Mexico, and he's going to talk a bit more about his work and the UHPH platform in housing. So welcome, Hector. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for the invitation. And the title of the presentation is Governing Metropolitan Areas in Latin America, Challenges and Opportunities for Research and Public Action. So the two key elements that I'm going to present today are the two key points. Is on one side is an overview of the LAC urban systems, and in particular the system that relates to large metropolis above 1 million inhabitants, and the other is to explore the governance challenges that these metropolitan areas entail. In particular, in relation to this second point, what I'm going to present is related to an ongoing discussion at regional level in Latin America that is promoted through the Urban Housing Practitioners Hub, which is a platform for research and practice around issues of urban planning and housing. And it's formed by several actors, governments, multilateral organizations. The Lincoln is part of it. And within this platform, we have different modules, and one of them is the housing laboratories that we call labs, and in which in these laboratories we discuss a question about planning and for knowledge and for practice. And in particular, what I'm going to explore with you about the governance challenges and opportunities is related to two laboratories that we held in June 2018 in Santo Domingo, which are the Lab on Metropolitan Governance and the Lab on Integrated National Policies and Frameworks. The presentation I divided into 4 different parts. The first one I will cover very briefly the urban system and overview in Latin America. Then I will move to the key characteristics of metropolitan areas that are of 1 million and above. And then I will move to metropolitan governance challenges and opportunities. And I will conclude with some remarks and summary of the key points of the presentation. So I'm going to start with the LAC urban system and overview. So I think maybe most of you are familiar with this. Latin America is the most urbanized region in the developing regions. To 2019, we are about 530 millions, which represent 80%, a little bit more than 80% of people living in urban areas. And the population is concentrated in only 2 countries, which is Brazil and Mexico, that account for more than 50% of this total urban population. In relation to the evolution, you can see here, like we move for the transition, the major transition between the 50s and the 90s to a more stabilized demographic transition that involves two key points. First of all, a migration that is now interurban phenomenon is not just anymore about rural areas to the big cities, but it's about inter-cities. And we see also a faster urban growth in mid-sized cities rather than in the largest one. And I would like to add a point that it comes with this process of urbanization, that are the decentralization and democratization processes that happen across the whole region between 80s and the 90s, and have developed, have helped to develop the role of local government, but also non-state actors, such as civil society, involved in public policy. And from this, you emerge, as Enrique mentioned, some innovation that have occurred in different municipalities in Latin American countries. Now, in relation to the typology of cities and urban system, this is a study made by UCLG in 2016 about intermediary cities. And what is really interesting in the study is that they map not only the capitals that we usually think when we think about Latin America, which is Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, but they map all the major metropolis above 1 million and the intermediary cities between 50,000 and 1 million. And what we see in this is really a constellation of cities, urban centers. And I think this is a key element to rethink this idea of mega regions. So we are talking about of regions such as Sao Paulo, Rio. We have this corridor that is in the northern part of the eastern of Brazil, with Fortaleza, Recife, and so on. So the second element to point out about these urban system characteristics is that most of them are hypertrophic capital city patterns. What does that mean? That most of the countries in Latin America, the capital concentrates the urban population. So the extreme cases are capitals that concentrates around 32 to 56% of urban population, which is Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. Then you have two cases of bicentric and tricentric patterns, which is Bolivia and Honduras. And then you have more polycentric systems, which is the case of Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. However, the specificity of these polycentric systems is that the largest city is really big compared to the next ones. So in the case of Mexico, for instance, you have Mexico City with around 20 million inhabitants, but then the second one is about 4 million, which is Guadalajara, and then Monterrey, which also 4 million. So you have this difference. Even if we are talking about a polycentric system, there is a imbalance between the major city and the rest of these large metropolis. And then in relation to corridors, clusters and corridors, it's interesting that to find out when you have this constellation of cities, that you find different clusters and corridors. So for instance, in the case of the clusters, we have, I thought about the clusters of automobile industry in Mexico, which are related actually to the north, to the US. And all this discussion about the trade and automobile between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. So you have this across the region. You have also corridors within countries and across the region. So for instance, we have the corridor of the Amazon River, which are all the cities that are along from Iquitos to Manaus. And you have also another one that we tend to refer also is between Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and the study of the UCLG also mentioned the connection between Rio, Sao Paulo, and Buenos Aires as a corridor, as you have a lot of really important system of cities that are in this corridor. You have also another corridor, which is the one that is in Chile, that goes from Santiago to the south part. So, as mentioned, Enrique, the important note that I want to make here is that this idea of corridor cluster is not mainstream in urban studies in Latin America. It's not something that we talk about it. Even with this idea, I think part of it is because we only focus on the major cities, the major capitals, and we don't see this more diverse universe. But also, it's something that is not in the literature on urban planning in Latin America. Now, I'm moving to the metropolitan areas of 1 million and above to point out key characteristics before going to the governance challenges and opportunities. In this sense, I would like to mention that the data that I'm using comes from a study in 2016. There is really difficult. There is a difficulty to find information about metropolitan areas across the region. Basically, you have studies on one country or two or three, but not in the whole region. So this study focused on the 68 metropolitan areas, the largest metropolitan areas in Latin America. So the key characteristics that they found are the following ones. First of all, the bulk of these metropolitan areas are between 1 million and 2. So we are talking about, it's not about these major cities, just Sao Paulo and Mexico City, but it's all the others that are this, mainly it's between 1 and 5, but the bulk really is between 1 and 2 million. And the population growth in these 68 metropolitan areas has been constant between 2000 and 2015, and has been higher than the national percentage. And one of the key elements that was already discussed before is the problem of the urban expansion beyond the urban density. And the most striking case is the north part of the region, which actually where you have the percentage of urban sprawl the highest, and is the case of Mexico, and in particular the case of Mexico City, Querétaro, and Mérida. So in the picture I show an aerial view of Mérida that from 98 to 2010 moved from 700,000 to 870,000 inhabitants, but the urban sprawl grew from 16 to 27 million hectares, which is huge. And it's in the forest, like all the environmental implication of that are huge. So now, in relation to the metropolitan composition and administration, what we see is that we have, in general, in all Latin America, a municipal fragmentation, which means that the metropolitan areas are related to different jurisdiction and municipal governments. The extreme case is Mexico City again, when you have 3 states, which is Mexico City as a state, the state of Mexico, and Hidalgo. So are the 3 states. And in this, you have 76 municipalities that are involved in this metropolitan area. And we are talking about 20 million people. So we are talking about this complexity of administrative and jurisdiction within the metropolitan area to manage this space. In relation to the administration, across the region, there are weak planning and institution around the governance, the metropolitan governance. So basically, the study mentioned that about 77% of these metropolitan areas have a normative framework and 65 have a metropolitan plan. But that doesn't mean that this plan and these normatives are actually are implemented. And only 50% of these metropolitan areas, that is around 30, have a metropolitan body to deal with issues. I would like to add in this slide on this administrative context, the development at national level in various countries in Latin America of national urban policies and institutions that have been looking at controlling urban expansion, which is one of the major issues, urban mobility, metropolitan governance, cities cooperation, and balancing the territories. And also we have the development of institutions at national level, the paradigmatic case of Ministry of Cities, which was created in 2003 in Brazil, and disappeared at the end of last year. And in the case of Mexico, which has been really a progress, we got a national ministry for planning and housing in 2013, and now it's like trying to work at a national level and working with these metropolitan areas. So now I'm gonna go to the challenges and opportunities. In relation to the challenges, I divided into 3 different sets of challenges. The first set is related to collaboration and democratization, that I think many of the presentation before discussed this. And one of the major challenges is the collaboration within and across the different sectors and scales and in a metropolitan scale, overcoming the municipal fragmentation that we have in Latin America, overcoming sectoral approaches, as you mentioned, James, and reducing the ambiguity of actor responsibility. Because this is also the problem, for instance, in the case of Mexico, when you have a mandate for the 3 levels of government and nobody knows really the responsibilities that they have. The other element, major challenge in relation to this collaboration is the redistribution of power among actors. These relate to the idea that that the metropolitan governance has a political dimension too that need to be taken into account. It's not only about coordination, but it's about political entities that are trying to fight and try to coordinate. And in relation to this, another element is what was mentioned already is the redistribution of benefits at burden of urbanization. And the case is one of the cases that can illustrate this is the airport in Mexico, which has been canceled, that it was proposed in 2014, and it's a national. It was a national strategy that was located in the metropolitan area that was affecting many different municipalities and it was the state of Mexico City and the city of Mexico City, the two entities that were involved in that. And the question is who's benefiting from what and who's paying for what. And in relation to the fact that only 5 companies were involved in the major contracts also. That one related to Slim, that was also part of the company. The holding company was also part of the winning team of the terminal. So all these actors coming together, and who is benefiting from what, and who is benefited for the money that the financing that they are doing in a specific location of the metropolis. And the third point, and I think it was also discussed before, is that one of the major challenges in the case of Latin America is the development of inclusive governance. So far, and in the past decades, the development of cities have excluded a lot of group of people from access to the city, but also access to policy-making processes. Again, in the case of Mexico, it was funny. The national government presented the airport in 2014. Nobody knew from where it came. And then even the decision, even it was a popular consultation, it was also kind of really from the top down. And it was not even discussion of what was going on in this around this project. The second set of challenges relate to capacity and knowledge production. In relation to the development of capacities, one of the major problems, and in particular in the smallest metropolitan areas in Latin America, is the weak capacities of local governments. And I will add to that the weak capacity of national government to understand what is happening in the territories and what is happening with the subnational actors. In relation to the production of data and knowledge, we have knowledge to some extent and data about the big cities, but we don't know what is happening in the other metropolitan areas, in the smaller one, the one that goes from 1 to 5 million. We don't know what is happening there. And then the third one is the development of academic sector capacities. One of the elements that I was surprised also is that to see that the capacity of research centers are also concentrated in the big cities. So we need to develop the capacities, as the challenges, how you develop research capacities with the smallest metropolitan areas. Finally, the third challenge is related to the public policy itself, to the what to do. And the first one, and it's related to this urban expansion, is how we can develop strategies on land use and housing that are articulated, and balancing the question between decentralization and multi-level coordination on land and housing. In relation to the national policies, I will argue that the main challenge is to acknowledge that we have this constellation of smaller metropolis and intermediary cities, and how they can be taken into account these national urban policies, and how the national urban policies can promote the intermunicipal and regional cooperation. And here comes again the idea of megaregions, how megaregions corridors can also be part of these strategies of the national government to push forward this governance of this large ensemble of urbanization. And the third element is the increase of experience, and how you incentivize the municipalities to engage, to explore metropolitan issues and engage in the process of creating alternatives for these metropolitan problems. Now, in relation to the opportunities, what I'm presenting here is more not like ready-made recipes, but it's more like approaches and consideration for thinking about building metropolitan governance. And these are key elements that came out from the discussion that we got in the different labs that we had in June in Santo Domingo. And the first one, it was really interesting, and I think relates to some of the discussion just before having lunch, that is to consider an incremental approach. We are not talking about from one day to another we will come to these boundaries and we say this is the metropolitan area and this is the body, but it's, the experience in Latin America has been more how you start this process little by little, starting for sectoral coordination and move forward. And the question is how you move forward. And balancing between formal and informal and centralized and decentralized agreements. Also recognizing that it's not only about building agreements, but also building legitimacy. It's not, again, it's not about this part of coordination, but it's how you put people collectively in a political, in the sense of polity. And the third is promoting participation and inclusion of municipal and non-state actors. Usually we tend to think when we discuss about metropolitan governance that is about state actors only, and maybe some experts, but it's about this interaction between state and non-state actors. The second set of opportunities is moving aside from traditional dichotomies and cases, and is reconsidering again this rural and urban divide, the top-down or bottom-up, like almost as they were divided, and local, national, and nature society in relation to climate change. We can no longer put a line between what is natural causes and what are social causes. It's more like an hybrid. And the third element in the opportunities is generate process of co-production, not only of knowledge, but also of alternatives. And this means creating collective processes that entail connecting knowledge and practices. In the case of Latin America, this connecting of knowledge is also about bringing, in particular, the Portuguese-speaking experience and knowledge come together with the Spanish ones, and also the English and French for the Caribbeans. So as a conclusion, as a concluding remark, I just want to pinpoint the key elements. So from the suburban system, urban system, I will say that what is interesting in thinking about these mega regions is that it appears a constellation. We are not talking about 4 cities, but we are talking about more than that. And they seem to be somehow connected. And in relation to the metropolis of 1 million and above, we know that they have been experiencing an important urban expansion in a context of municipal fragmentation and weak metropolitan planning. And that's one of the conditions that we have today in Latin America. In relation to the challenges, I covered these 3 sets, which is about collaboration and democratization, capacity building and knowledge production, and public policy, in particular the strategies for land use, around land use and housing. And in relation to the opportunities, as I mentioned, is about approaches that we can consider to start building this governance. And I think I take it was mentioned this concept like metropolis or this mega region as a process. So it's a process in which we need to consider incremental approaches, reconsider our traditional way of thinking in a dichotomical way, and promote this process of co-production, not only about knowledge, but about the alternatives, how the knowledge can serve us to move on and move forward in what is happening on the ground. Thank you.
We do have studies on mega regions. There has been a tradition of geographers in the region to do these studies on functional urban systems, and they identify many of these things on considering some of the variables that are, for instance, connectivities and things like that. And so, but I entirely follow that conversation that Enrique just opened. But the thing is how to define them. It's whether, is that population or is the type of connectivities that we're talking about? And so depending on how you define these variables, or what is the discriminant value, if you variable, you're going to find megacities or megaregions more or less, and you would define the sizes of them, of course, right? So this is an issue that is recognized from the policy point of view, to the point that in 2015, Brazil issued a new statute for the metropolitan areas. And this is pretty, it's a very bold proposal. As you know, we already had the statute of the cities, and that is one of the, has been widely studied as a very advanced type of corpus of norms and legislation, how cities should develop. But this one now takes into the metropolitan areas. The interesting thing about this tool, I would say, is that it's not as yet mandatory, but it's a faculty that the central government makes it possible. This means that you have a number of obligations that municipalities within a metropolitan area have to fulfill. Now, the main one that is in this statute is that they should come with a plan for integrated urban development. They may not do it, but if they want money from the federal level, they better do it. And there are a number of issues that have to be included in this kind of integrated urban master plan, if you want, okay? This is, I think it's an interesting thing to be observed, how it's still in its early stages, and how far would it go. It makes available a number of new tools to deal with how cities should cooperate and should address certain issues like sewage, addressing waste, transportation, water. And by the way, this is not in Brazil during the military times. There was they introduced this mesopower of a authority at the metropolitan area, and that was from the political point of view. This was one way of reducing the power of the mayor. So it was a very politicized thing, and one of the reasons why we gave up on that was with the redemocratization. This was considered to be a kind of a rescues of dictatorship. I just want to make now 3 points. The first one has to do with we're identifying, and I don't know how far this kind of evidence is coming along in the U.S., for instance, or other places, is that the increasing cost of urban infrastructure and service provision with city sizes. And that has been, this has been observed, and that the cost for waste disposal, for transit, for water and sewage systems, there are not, the idea that you have huge economies of scale is no longer. People don't believe in this thing, and I don't know how is this issue discussed here. This means that when we discuss this topic of cities grow because there is some allegedly some agglomeration economies, then the main issue is who benefits and who pays for that, right? So that's why some of these issue of redistribution of costs and benefits of urbanization come so strongly, because evidently if cities continues to increase its size of the mega regions, continue to be something economically making sense. this doesn't mean that it's benefiting everybody, right? This depends on how these costs and benefits are distributed. So this is why some of these tools become so important. The second thing has to do with governance that Hector raised. We know that, and this is one of the reasons why we have the statute of the metropolitan areas, is that horizontally it's very hard to redistribute, to do the Robin Hood policies. You need some high authority to actually implement or command that redistribution. So that introduces interesting issues also for us to discuss if you're dealing with the costs and benefits in metropolitan areas, what are the levels where decision makers are, or where the policy is being made on that. Finally, and this is now going back to the 70s when we were in the regional science. These topics were very high. You remember the gravity models and all that, and the whole paraphernalia of tools that were associated and discussions associated with that. And then this brings to fore again for our discussion, and I don't know how relevant this may be, of function versus distance. And if nowadays what we're talking about is not so much the annihilation of space with time, as is one of the discussions, where function is kind of overcoming distance. This is important because we're in the business of this exercise that is being done here has to do with, can we predict to some extent what is, if things continue to be the way they are, what is going to happen? And there are a number of changes in functions and new technologies, and some of these issues have been commented here. So how can we predict why certain areas are going to grow faster and will sort of suck other areas and will have other areas gravitating around it? How can you predict? In the 70s, this was a very lively discussion, to the point that Walter Isaac at the time was fumbling with the idea of time-space development models, relativity theory, to try to understand how can you explain one city growing relatively faster than others within a very interconnected space. And then at some point they even got to catastrophe theory to understand why certain cities would grow fast. So it's not a new discussion to some extent, but this notion of how can you predict and I guess some of the exercise that we're doing here has to do with our possibility of actually predicting something that may happen if things continue the way they are. And this is not linear. That part we know. We're not talking about simply extending existing. It's not simply a linear process. How can we actually model this to some extent and anticipate certain undesirable changes and interfere in that? So I guess this is these are my comments. Thanks.